Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be covering a concept known as anchoring. And if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button, click on your notification icon. So the first position we're going to take a look at happens after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5. This is called the Italian game setup. So first off, what is anchoring? How can we use it? What does it mean? Is it good? Is it bad? What's the difference between an anchored piece and a loose piece? So an anchored piece, quite simply, is defined as a piece that is developed that is protected by a pawn. So the piece needs to be actively protected by a pawn. It's not like a weak square where the square is weak if a pawn can never again defend that square, but a square is not weak as long as a pawn can theoretically defend it. A piece is unanchored if it isn't actively being defended by a pawn. So right at the beginning of the Italian game, we have two pieces in the position that are developed that are unanchored. These are immediately loose pieces for both sides. And of course we have two pieces that are developed and are firmly anchored. Both the knights are defended by pawns, so these pieces are anchored. Now the reason this is important to keep track of in any position is because an unanchored piece or a loose piece always has the potential to be captured or to have some type of, tactic happen or a check happen where that piece could potentially be picked up. Even this bishop on c5, there's scenarios where if this queen were to come to e2, there would actually be an immediate threat of bishop f7 check. As a matter of fact, if I were to play queen e2 right here on this move, I would have an immediate threat of bishop takes f7 check that only works because this bishop on c5 is unanchored. And I might be able to get away with that move because I could get my bishop back immediately. So the line that we're going to take a look at is in the Evans Gambit, because in the Evans Gambit, this bishop will often retreat to the a5 square, and it'll remain on a5 for quite some time. Now, the thing about the a5 square is the bishop on a5 is not an anchored piece, and the bishop on a5 will be more comfortably placed on the b6 square. So there's kind of this dance that goes on within the theoretical lines of the Evans Gambit, where white is constantly trying to take advantage of the fact that this piece is not anchored, and black is constantly trying to take the first opportunity to anchor it. And then once the piece finally does get anchored, white will try to once again unanchor it. White's going to put some effort into trying to get that piece off of its anchored square so that white can take advantage of that piece being loose and use his development lead to potentially capture that piece. So one of the main lines here is white will strike in the middle with d4, and black will try to keep the position closed with pawn to d6, and white will play the move queen b3. So one of the ideas behind this setup with queen on b3 and bishop on c4 is that white is making this direct threat against f7, but there's this other threat. And the other threat is to take advantage of this loose bishop on a5. And this is something that you have to understand about loose pieces. Loose pieces in a position are a weakness, whether or not you see an immediate tactic that can take advantage of them. They're a constant weakness that you have to keep a lookout for. You're constantly having to calculate, am I hanging that piece? Because they are really easy pieces to hang, because really nothing is defending them that's solid. The pawn is the best defender in chess. If your piece is nailed down to a pawn, that piece isn't going anywhere. It's very difficult for you to lose that piece. If that piece is loose and it's just hanging out in the middle of the board somewhere, it's very easy to lose that piece. So if black were to continue with, say, queen e7 to defend that pawn, white could continue with pawn to d5, and after the knight retreats, queen to b5 check would pick up this loose bishop. And that would be a pretty serious problem. And that's why the correct theoretical move is actually to play queen d7, and we have to play queen d7 and block our bishop and prevent our own development as black, simply because we haven't had time yet to fix the problem of our unanchored piece. And as a matter of fact, after white captures on e5, the correct move is to immediately anchor this piece. And this is the correct theory. This is what we're supposed to do. And it's very dangerous to do other things, because it's very easy to take advantage of this unanchored piece. Let me give a few examples of bad theory that people have played against me in the past that works incredibly poorly. So one idea is I've had a lot of people play knight takes e5, which isn't a great line. knight takes e5, d takes e5, castles. Now, there is actually an immediate threat here. White is threatening rook d1, queen e7, queen b5. So because of this threat, black is going to be required to do something to block that threat. And as it turns out, black doesn't have a great move. Like, all of the moves that black can try here should lead to somewhere between major advantage white to decisive advantage white. So the natural move is, let's go ahead and anchor the piece now. But of course now we're way behind in development, and it's kind of too late. White has a very cool tactic available to him. He has rook d1, queen e7, and this very cool idea, bishop takes f7 check. And black's position would be completely lost at this point. The whole idea is, after something like, say, queen f7, we would have rook d8, and if king takes rook, we're picking up the queen. And if king e7, we're going to have bishop g5, knight f6, and then either exchanging queens and taking the rook, or probably just taking the rook, is going to be major advantage white. So that's the reason why black will usually try to play bishop b6. This is the mainline theory. He's trying to immediately anchor that piece. And what white should do at this point is white should immediately try to unanchor that piece. White should play a4, and his intention is simply to play a5. Even if that sacrifices material, what he's trying to do is he's trying to set up a situation where that bishop can once again become loose and can become unanchored. He's trying to attack the bishop and prevent it from being anchored by those pawns. So like a main line would run like knight a5, queen a2, takes, takes, and now it's very important that we play a move like knight e7, because our new anchor point is actually going to be that c5 square. So that's why, as natural as it looks to finally play d takes e5, this move would be completely losing, because we've eliminated our anchor point. So when we're talking about anchored pieces, we also have to think about anchor points. This bishop had an anchor point on b6. This anchor point is being threatened with pawn to a5. So the bishop needs another anchor point. The other anchor point that bishop had a move ago was the c5 square. Once we take on e5, this bishop no longer has an anchor point. And now once we play pawn to a5, that bishop is now completely lost, because it has nowhere to go that is safe, that is anchored. All the unanchored squares are covered by white, and therefore black just lost a whole piece. So this type of tactic is very, very common, especially in certain openings. This type of idea of taking advantage of these unanchored pieces is very, very common, especially in openings like the Evans Gambit. But they do take place in other openings. Anchoring is a very important concept, and it comes up a lot even in Master Play and even in Grandmaster Play, especially when we're talking about the center. Because a lot of times if you overextend your center, or you run out of center pawns, you can actually run out of anchor points. And if you have a whole bunch of loose pieces in your position, and your opponent has a very solid anchored position with his pieces, that can be a huge advantage for him. So if we take a look at another opening, we're going to take a look at, instead of the Italian game, we're going to take a look at the Ruy Lopez. And I'm actually showing you a game that I personally played. This was one of my early wins as a youth, one of my first couple of wins against a strong chess master. I was playing a game against Mohamed Tabakovic. I had the white pieces, and Tabakovic was a very strong chess master that used to play back in Minnesota. And we had a wild game, which was just par for the course. When you were playing Mohamed, he always played kind of wild and aggressive openings, so he played a Schliemann against me. And of course, back then, we didn't have the same kind of access to the modern engines and computers that we have now. So the preparation wasn't as top-notch. So I know there's going to be some mistakes in this game, so please forgive me. Keep in mind this game was played probably 20 years ago. So knight c3, f takes e4, knight takes e4, knight f6, queen e2. I think knight f6 instead of queen e2 is considered better now. d5, knight takes e5, d takes e5. I played knight c6, which interestingly enough back then, the engines that we had back then bashed that move and thought queen c4 was better. But now modern engines are backing my original move, which is knight c6. So I find that kind of interesting. So knight c6 takes, bishop d7, takes. So this is an interesting situation that I already had. I have traded two pieces for a rook, which ordinarily this is probably a bad trade for me, but I got some pawns for it. So the main thing that I started looking at right here was, how am I going to possibly make my rooks better than his minor pieces? And the conclusion that I came to was, if his pieces had anchor points in the middle of the board and they could anchor themselves, I think his minor pieces are going to be quite a bit stronger than my rooks. But if his minor pieces were loose, my rooks had the chance of having a better scope and better potential than his pieces, because his pieces would be forced to defend each other, and they would be significantly weaker. And that's the strategy that I took. I started going after the center pawn immediately. I wanted to break this down. I wanted to get rid of his center pawns and get rid of his anchor points. So I played d3, bishop e7 got played, takes, knight takes, and then I played what to a lot of people they thought was crazy. Like, I think most human beings would just castle kingside here. And actually, the engine thinks I should just castle kingside here. But, like I said, I had my strategy in mind. I did have a firm understanding of anchoring even back then, and I had come up with a plan, and I followed through with it, and it turned out to be the right plan, because the result of the game ended up being a positive one. I played queen h5, and then queen e5, and this whole crazy queen maneuver was basically just designed so I could rip on c7 with my queen. And now this position just looks absolutely insane to a beginner. White has managed to develop one piece, has developed absolutely nothing else, and I've got my queen out, and I've got nothing else developed. But what I've managed to do is I've managed to eliminate all the pawns from here to here, which means as long as I survive, if I get my king out of the middle of the board and I get my rooks to open files, my opponent won't be able to anchor any of his minor pieces, because there are simply no anchor points at all. And that turned out to actually be the decisive factor in the game. A few moves later, after bishop c4, I got to play c4, and then, thank God, I got my king out of the middle. I got castled. And there was an opportunity in here that I actually missed. I played bishop f4, he played knight c4. I actually had the chance to play rook e7, king e7, queen c3. And apparently that would have been winning kind of on the spot. But instead, I just played kind of the positional idea that I originally had, just keep his pieces unanchored, centralize all my pieces, and I just assumed that this position should be a winning position. And it's kind of a cool position, because even engines kind of get this position wrong, even modern engines. When I first put this on Stockfish, when it gave its initial assessment, it thought maybe bishop takes g2 was fine and black was okay. And then it immediately started saying that after bishop takes g2, after the move that I played, it started immediately saying, oh, no, white's actually better, actually white's quite a bit better. And so that's what he did. He played bishop takes g2, and then I immediately played rook d6. And the whole point is that I'm going to be taking this bishop on f6 pretty much regardless, and none of black's pieces can protect themselves, none of black's pieces are anchored, and I'm going to have mating threats on top of that. So black's position should essentially be indefensible. And that's kind of what happened. It went knight d5, I played rook f6, king f6, queen d6, we have king f7, and then my technique was it wasn't as good as it could have been. I played queen d7, king f6, and there was this forced mate starting with bishop e5. Something like this would have been forced checkmate, but understandably this was actually a little difficult to see. But this was actually a forced mate kind of on the spot. Instead, I played something that was just much easier to calculate. I played rook e6 check, king f5, and now again queen f7 was apparently a forced mate as well that I missed, but I just played the simple idea. I played rook c6, king f4, and then rook c8 with the idea of simply trapping this queen on the a8 square, because now the queen has nowhere to go, and that was basically a wrap. So on the Grandmaster level, so we looked at just examples in kind of the opening and opening preparation. We looked at an example from this game that I played kind of in my early career, like on kind of the master level. Does this type of thing happen on the Grandmaster level as well, where Grandmasters can't anchor their pieces? Well, of course it does. Usually it happens when the same type of thing that happened here happens, where they lose their center pawns, or they lose their anchor points, or a lot of times they might overextend their center, and then their anchor points are gone. So a great example of that is Latier versus Fischer, played in Leipzig in 1960. So that game was a King's Indian defense. I'm going to go ahead and flip the board so we can see this from Fischer's perspective. He went d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, castles kingside. So this was one of Fischer's favorite ideas, was castle kingside and give white the opportunity to overextend his center. So why is overextending your center a big deal? Why don't we want to do this? Well, when you overextend your center in the opening before you've developed your pieces to back it up, none of your pieces behind those pawns will have any anchor points because pawns can't move backwards to anchor your pieces, whereas all of black's pieces will be anchored. And that's exactly what happened here. Lattier extended his center, and he went ahead and he went to go protect it. Well, now all of these locations back here are all permanently loose squares. You can plant pieces on those squares, but there's no way to anchor them. And that's kind of a problem. So Fischer attacks the center, and he goes ahead and he tries to break down the pawns. Lattier tries to develop a little bit to try to catch up in his development. And then we reach a really critical moment right around here. If you take a look at this bishop on e3, not only is it not anchored, it doesn't have any way to anchor. There isn't an anchor point that it can use, and there isn't a safe square where it can hide. So at this point, Fischer's strategy is really, really easy. He's going to develop his last piece, he's going to put his rooks on the open file, and he's going to kill that bishop. And there's not a whole lot Lattier can do about it. The bishop isn't defended by a pawn, and for the most part, even if it's a sacrifice, taking that bishop should win the game, because there isn't going to be a safe place for this king to hide. This king is way out in the open. Once that bishop disappears, all these dark squares around the king are going to become weak, and there shouldn't be any defense. And it really was that simple. The game ended in pretty short order. Fischer just developed his knight, developed a rook, captured, doubled the rooks, and then captured. Just in sequence, just didn't have to deviate at all. The whole point being is after that bishop disappears, there is absolutely no way for white to defend his position. White captured, black captured, white captured, and then Fischer played the move that ended the game. Fischer sacrificed his queen, and white immediately resigned because he can't capture this queen because the move bishop to h6 would be mate. So that's how anchored pieces and unanchored pieces work in chess. An anchored piece is just a piece that is developed, that is defended by a pawn. And an unanchored piece is a piece that's developed that's not defended by a pawn. So when you're playing, one of the things that you really do need to keep track of is where your anchor points are at, if your pieces can anchor, and if you have loose pieces, how you can anchor them. Having more loose pieces should be considered a weakness in the same way that having a weak pawn is a weakness, or having an isolated pawn is a weakness, or having doubled pawns is a weakness, or having a weak square is a weakness. Having a loose piece is the same type of weakness. And you have to keep track of them, and you have to try to really have as many anchored pieces as possible and as few loose pieces as possible in most positions if you want to have good results. So anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.